Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to really break down complex history into something clear and useful.
That's the goal. Making sense of the past.
And today, we're jumping into the second part of our Navigating Modern India series. Think about a giant empire once seemingly invincible.
Yeah, the Mughals.
Exactly. But it's starting to show cracks, big ones, from the inside out. It's a story of, well, decline, but also new beginnings, all happening just before a massive change.
A real turning point in history.
Our focus is Unit 2, Chapter 4, India on the Eve of British Conquest. We're relying heavily on Modern India by Spectrum, a key text for many.
A fantastic resource for understanding this period.
Absolutely. So whether you're deep in exam prep, maybe for the civil services, or you're just fascinated by how things unfolded, how this huge subcontinent fell under European influence.
This deep dive should give you those critical insights. You need to understand this transition.
Right. Our mission today, to unpack the tangled web of problems facing the Mughals. Why were they weakening?
And then who stepped into the gap? These rising regional states?
Yeah, and what was life actually like then? The society, the economy, the culture.
We need to look at that too. It wasn't just politics.
And finally, those early European steps. How did they go from traders to, well, setting the stage for conquest?
It's a lot to cover, but it's crucial.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's unpack this pivotal moment and see how that giant crumbled, leaving space for something entirely new and foreign.
It really is a period of profound transition. And when we say India on the eve of British conquest, the first name that still comes to mind, the sort of ghost of the feast, is the Mughal Empire.
Looming large, even in decline.
Exactly. But as you said, deeply troubled. Facing an existential crisis, really. Challenges from within, challenges from outside. The grandeur was definitely fading. Fragility was setting in.
And it wasn't like a sudden collapse, was it? More like a slow crumbling.
A slow unraveling is a good way to put it.
And the first big internal issue seems to be leadership. Or, well, the lack of it after Aurangzeb.
That's absolutely central. After Aurangzeb died in 1707, the emperors who followed, well, they just weren't of the same caliber. Often weak, more interested in pleasure than in the tough job of ruling.
Any particular examples stand out?
Oh, definitely. Muhammad Shah, for instance, reigned quite a long time, 1719 to 1748. But he was known as Rangila.
Rangila.
Meaning the colorful or the pleasure-loving. Gives you an idea. He loved luxury, music, the arts, but wasn't so engaged with the nuts and bolts of running the empire.
Which must have been needed then, more than ever.
Desperately needed. Now, to be fair, he did manage, with help from Nizam-ul-Mulk, a very capable noble, to get rid of the Said brothers.
Ah, the kingmakers. They seem to wield a lot of power.
They did. They could basically install and remove emperors, so getting rid of them was significant. But Muhammad Shah's reign overall saw huge losses of Mughal authority. It shows how a ruler's detachment can really speed up the decay.
And this leadership weakness, it wasn't just about the emperor's personality, right? It had real consequences on the ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It directly weakened the center's grip. And ambitious people noticed.
Like Nizam-ul-Mulk himself.
Precisely. He helped Muhammad Shah, but then, seeing the weakness, he went off to the Deccan and basically set up his own state, Hyderabad, in 1724. He paid lip service to the emperor, but he was independent.
So the provinces started peeling away.
Exactly. And the core itself was vulnerable. Think about this. In 1737, the Maratha Peshwa, Bajirao Asi, he invaded Delhi.
Invaded the capital.
With a huge army. That's the shocking part. With just 500 cavalrymen, a small force. They didn't occupy it for long, but the fact they could just ride in.
Wow. That sends a message.
A huge message. It showed everyone just how exposed, how militarily weak the Mughal capital had become. The psychological blow was immense. That aura of invincibility, gone.
It's a steep fall, isn't it? When you think of Akbar, Shah Jahan, the power they wielded.
A completely different era.
And it gets worse for the later Mughals. The source calls them English pensioners. That really says it all about the power shift.
It's a stark and frankly sad description. Think about Shah Alam II. He was the emperor during the Battle of Buxar in 1764. A major battle.
Right, we'll get to that one.
But by 1765, the year after, where is he? Under the protection of the East India Company, living in Allahabad.
Under their protection, the emperor.
Yes, and it was the same Shah Alam II who granted the company the Diwani, that crucial right.
The right to collect revenue.
Exactly, from Bengal, Bihar, Orissa. Hugely rich provinces. He essentially signed away the financial power of the empire in that region to the company. A monumental step towards their dominance.
So they got the money without the headache of actually governing.
That was the beauty of it for them initially. Later, Shah Alam II tried to get free, even went back to Delhi under Maratha protection for a while.
But it didn't last.
No. By 1803, he was back under English protection. And the final emperor, the Padshah Shah II, or Zafar,
The poet emperor?
yes, he became a symbol for the 1857 revolt.
Mm-hmm.
But afterwards, captured, exiled to Rangoon, died there. And in 1858, Queen Victoria's proclamation formally ended the Mughal Empire. From rulers of India to pensioners, then exiles. That's the trajectory.
A truly dramatic decline. But it wasn't just the emperors. The whole administrative structure was creaking, wasn't it? Like the zamindars.
Ah, the zamindars, yes. They were supposed to be the local pillars of the empire.
Collecting revenue, keeping order, providing troops sometimes.
That was the idea, crucial intermediaries. But if the central government got weaker, well, their loyalty started shifting. Why send revenue to a distant, ineffective emperor when you could keep it yourself or build up your own power locally?
So they started acting more independently.
Many did. They might withhold revenue or just not provide the military support they were supposed to. Some even started carving out their own little territories. This decentralization just starved the central empire of funds and soldiers.
Pulling out the bricks from the foundation.
The very good analogy. It weakened the empire from the ground up.
And then there was this thing called the Jagirdari crisis. It sounds almost modern, like an economic term. What was that about?
It was absolutely fundamental to the Mughal system's breakdown. The Jagirdari system was how the empire paid its top officials and nobles, the Jagirdars.
Instead of cash salaries?
Often, yes. They were given temporary rights to collect revenue from a piece of land, a jagir. In return, they had to maintain soldiers for the emperor and perform administrative tasks.
Okay, seems straightforward. So what was the crisis?
The crisis was essentially a shortage of jagirs. There weren't enough productive lands to assign to the ever-increasing number of nobles demanding them. Think of it like musical chairs, but with land grants.
Not enough chairs for everyone.
Exactly. And this shortage led to all sorts of problems. Intense competition among nobles, corruption to get the best jagirs, and existing jagirdars trying to squeeze as much money as possible from their land in the short time they held it.
Which must have been terrible for the peasants.
Absolutely terrible. It led to oppression, administrative chaos, and a nobility that was often more focused on its own income than on serving the empire effectively. The central government couldn't manage the system anymore.
So the administrative machinery itself was breaking down?
Critically so. William Irvine, a historian, argued that this internal decay, this Jagirdari crisis, made the empire hopelessly debilitated. Even before the major external blows really landed, he felt the rot had set in deep, even under Aurangzeb, due to these structural flaws.
That's a powerful point. The internal weakness created the conditions for collapse. And speaking of Aurangzeb, his policies didn't help either, did they? Reversing some of Akbar's more inclusive approaches.
No, they definitely contributed to the alienation. Aurangzeb was a devout Muslim, and some of his policies reflected that, which reversed the more tolerant approach of predecessors like Akbar.
Like reimposing the jizya tax.
Exactly. The jizya, a poll tax on non-Muslims. Akbar had abolished it. Aurangzeb brought it back. This alienated large sections of the population, particularly powerful groups like the Rajputs.
Who had been crucial allies for the Mughals before.
Absolutely crucial. Under Akbar, they were pillars of the empire. Aurangzeb's policies turned many of them from staunch supporters into, well, enemies, or at least deeply resentful groups. That weakened the empire militarily and politically.
Undermining the very base of support.
And you combine that with his long, costly wars, especially in the Deccan. It drained the treasury, weakened the army, and created widespread unrest.
And speaking of unrest, the Marathas really rose during this period, didn't they? They weren't just a regional nuisance. They were a major challenge to Mughal authority itself.
Oh, the Marathas were more than a challenge. They were a fundamental threat to the empire's existence by this point. Under leaders like Shivaji initially, and then the Peshwas, they didn't just fight for independence.
They actively undermined the Mughals.
Completely. They shattered the Mughal military's reputation, proving it could be beaten. They raided deep into Mughal territory, draining its wealth through demands for Chauth and Sardishmukhi, essentially protection money and a claim to superior rights.
Yeah, so they were bleeding the empire dry financially.
Yes, and spreading disorder. They established what's called an imperium in imperio, a state within a state effectively controlling vast areas, while the Mughals could only watch. They were a major factor in the empire's exhaustion and collapse.
So just to recap the internal situation, weak rulers, nobles and zamindars pulling away, the administrative system, Jagirdari, in crisis, alienating policies, and powerful groups like the Marathas actively challenging them. It's a grim picture.
It is. The empire was hollowed out from within, like a magnificent old tree but rotten inside.
And then came the storms from outside to knock it over.
Precisely. These internal weaknesses made the empire incredibly vulnerable to external shocks. And those shocks came hard.
The first really big one was Nadir Shah's invasion,
Right.
1739.
Yes, Nadir Shah, the Persian ruler. His invasion was catastrophic for the Mughals. He defeated the Mughal army decisively at the Battle of Karnal.
And then marched on Delhi.
And what followed was just unprecedented plunder and massacre. For nearly 2 months, the city was looted. Nadir Shah carried away unimaginable wealth.
Including the famous Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond.
Both. Along with, estimates say, maybe 70 crore rupees worth of cash, jewels, goods. It crippled the Mughal treasury and prestige.
But it wasn't just about the loot, was it? Didn't he also take territory?
He did. He annexed all the Mughal provinces west of the Indus River, including Kabul. This significantly shrank the empire's boundaries and exposed the vulnerability of the northwestern frontier.
What was the immediate fallout? You mentioned aftershocks. How did it change things?
It fundamentally changed the political calculus in India. It showed everyone, starkly, that the Mughal emperor couldn't even protect his own capital. Power was up for grabs. As one source puts it, it broke existing centers of authority and ushered in an era where plunder, rather than negotiation, became the most effective tool. It basically opened the floodgates.
Laid the groundwork for more instability, more invasions.
Exactly. And the next major wave came from Ahmad Shah Abdali.
The Afghan ruler. He came repeatedly, didn't he?
He did. Ahmad Shah Abdali, also known as Ahmad Shah Durrani, invaded North India several times between 1748 and 1767. He was initially focused on Punjab, but his campaigns reached deep into Mughal territory.
And his most famous intervention was the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761.
Panipat, 1761, a landmark battle. But this time, it wasn't primarily the Mughals he fought. It was the Marathas.
Ah, the other major power vying for supremacy.
Precisely. The Marathas had expanded significantly and were looking to control Delhi and potentially establish a pan-Indian empire. Abdali decisively defeated them at Panipat.
So Abdali defeated the Marathas. How did that help the British, ultimately?
Well, it was devastating for the Marathas. It shattered their ambitions of replacing the Mughals as the dominant power across India. But crucially, it also meant that the only other major Indian power capable of potentially resisting the Europeans was now severely weakened.
It created a power vacuum.
A huge power vacuum. Abdali didn't stay to rule India himself. He eventually withdrew. The Mughals were a shadow. The Marathas were crippled. Who was left? This battle essentially cleared the field, leaving no single strong indigenous force that could unite India against the rising European powers, particularly the British.
So connecting the dots. Internal decay made the Mughals vulnerable. Nadir Shah exposed that weakness brutally. And then Abdali at Panipat removed the main Indian rival power. It's like a perfect storm clearing the way.
It really was. A combination of internal rot and these devastating external blows left North India, especially, fragmented and exhausted. The stage was well and truly set for a new power to rise.
Okay, so the Mughal Empire is fading, effectively creating this power vacuum. What rushes in to fill it? You mentioned the rise of regional states.
Exactly. As the Mughal sun was setting, you see this dawn of, well, regional powers all across India. It's a period of fragmentation, yes, but also one where powerful new kingdoms start forging their own paths.
And this wasn't just random chaos. There were distinct types of states emerging.
That's a good way to look at it. Broadly, we can see 3 categories emerging from the Mughal decline.
Okay, what's the first type?
First, you have the successor states. These are basically former Mughal provinces where the governors, who were often powerful Mughal nobles, gradually asserted their independence and established their own dynasties.
So they kind of broke away formally.
Or just became independent in practice, de facto independent. Hyderabad is the classic example we already mentioned. Nizam-ul-Mulk, a top Mughal official, set it up in 1724.
Right. Any others?
Oh, yes. Bengal is another huge one. Under Murshid Quli Khan, starting around 1717, it became incredibly prosperous and largely independent, just sending a nominal payment to Delhi. His successor, Alivardi Khan, made that independence even clearer after 1740.
And Bengal was vital, economically.
Hugely vital. And then there's Awadh in modern Uttar Pradesh. Sadat Khan Burhan-ul-Mulk established his dynasty there around 1722. These were large, important parts of the old empire now going their own way.
Okay, so successor states breaking away from the Mughal structure. What's the second category?
The second type we can call independent kingdoms. These weren't necessarily former Mughal provinces breaking off cleanly. They often arose out of the general political instability, sometimes led by figures who weren't originally high-ranking Mughal officials, or represented older regional powers reasserting themselves.
The examples.
Mysore, down south, is a key one. It rose dramatically under Hyder Ali, becoming a major military force that would seriously challenge the British later on.
Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan.
Exactly. Then you have Kerala, where King Martandavarma consolidated the state of Travancore, built a modern army, and cleverly navigated the politics between European powers.
And the Rajputs, they fit in here.
Yes, the Rajput states like Jaipur, Amber, Jodhpur, Marwar, Udaipur, Mewar. They had a complex relationship with the Mughals, sometimes allies, sometimes resistant. In the 18th century, rulers like Sawai Jai Singh II of Jaipur made serious efforts to reestablish greater independence and expand their influence. They formed alliances and controlled significant territories.
So these were new or resurgent powers filling the gaps. And the third category?
The third category is sort of implicit, often called rebel states, or states formed out of prolonged resistance to Mughal rule.
Like the Marathas we talked about.
Precisely. The Maratha Confederacy is the prime example. They actively fought the Mughals and carved out a massive territory. The Sikhs in Punjab are another. After years of persecution and resistance, they organized themselves into powerful misls or confederacies and established control over the Punjab region.
And the Jats, too.
Yes, the Jats, an agricultural community around Delhi and Agra, also established strong states like Furatpur, capitalizing on the Mughal decline. These groups often had a history of conflict with this central authority.
So a real patchwork of different states emerging. But you mentioned something interesting earlier. Even though they were independent, many still gave a nod to the Mughal emperor. Why bother?
It's a fascinating aspect. Even powerful rulers, Marathas included sometimes, might strike coins in the Mughal emperor's name or seek his symbolic approval for their position.
Why, if he had no real power?
It speaks to the lingering idea of legitimacy. The Mughal emperor, even as a figurehead, still represented a kind of ultimate pan-Indian sovereignty in the minds of many. It was a tradition. Acknowledging him, even symbolically, could lend a veneer of legitimacy to their own rule, especially in the eyes of other powers or their own subjects. It was like a symbolic umbrella, even if the umbrella was full of holes.
A useful fiction, perhaps.
Perhaps. And the nature of these states was, well, fundamentally regional. They relied on local support, the zamindars in their area, the merchants, local military leaders, chieftains. Power was often built through collaboration and negotiation with these local groups.
So they had strong local roots.
Generally, yes. Although there were exceptions. Mysore, particularly under Hyder and Tipu, tended to be more centralized and didn't rely on or recognize local chieftains in quite the same way. They tried to build a more direct state power.
But this regional focus, while maybe good for local stability, had a downside, didn't it, in terms of facing an external threat?
Absolutely. That was the crucial limitation. Because they were so focused on their own region, their own rivalries with neighboring Indian states.
They were often fighting each other.
Constantly. Marathas versus Mysore, Hyderabad versus Marathas, Rohillas versus Awadh. This constant infighting prevented any kind of unified front. There was no pan-Indian consciousness or strategy emerging.
So they couldn't unite against, say, the growing European power.
Precisely. Each state dealt with the Europeans individually, often trying to use them against their Indian rivals, which, in the long run, played right into European hands. This fragmentation, this lack of unity, was perhaps the single biggest factor enabling the eventual British conquest. Their regional strength was, ironically, a collective weakness.
A landscape of vibrant but ultimately divided powers. So, with all this political upheaval, what was daily life like for the farmers, the traders, the artisans? Was it just chaos?
That's the crucial context we need. While the political stage was chaotic, life for ordinary people, the socio-economic fabric, it had continuities, resilience, but also deep-seated problems. It wasn't stagnant, but it wasn't necessarily improving for everyone.
Let's start with agriculture. Still the backbone of the economy, I assume.
Absolutely. The vast majority of people worked the land. And Indian peasants were incredibly hardworking, skilled in their traditional ways, but the techniques were generally backward, not much innovation happening. And the bigger issue was exploitation.
How so?
The share of the produce that the peasant actually got to keep was often miserably inadequate, as the source puts it. Why? Because so many people had a claim on it. The state, the local zamindar, the jagirdar if it was assigned land, sometimes revenue farmers who bought the right to collect taxes.
Layer upon layer of demands.
Exactly. And these demands were often arbitrary, excessive. It left the cultivator with very little, often just enough to survive, sometimes not even that, discouraging any improvement or investment.
And you mentioned this foreshadowed later conditions.
Yes, the source notes that these conditions of exploitation actually worsened under British rule. So the British didn't introduce exploitation. They inherited a system where it was already rampant, and arguably they made it more systematic and perhaps even harsher.
A sobering continuity. Okay, if agriculture was tough for the peasants, what about trade and industry? Was India a significant player globally?
Oh, absolutely. Economically, this is where 18th century India really shone, despite the political turmoil. First, India was largely self-sufficient. It produced most of what it needed. Handicrafts, agricultural goods, didn't need large imports.
Okay, self-sufficient, but was it exporting?
Massively. Indian goods were in huge demand worldwide. Textiles, spices, sugar, indigo, saltpeter, you name it. Europe, Southeast Asia, West Asia, they all wanted Indian products.
So exports were much higher than imports.
Consistently. Which led to that famous phenomenon in India as a sink of precious metals. Because the trade balance was so favorable, gold and silver flowed into India continuously to pay for its goods.
India was getting rich from trade, essentially.
The country as a whole was accumulating bullion, yes. Though how evenly that wealth was distributed is another question, given the peasant situation.
And textiles were the star performer.
Without a doubt. Indian textiles were world-renowned. Cottons like long cloths, selampurs, maries, silks, beautifully painted and printed fabrics. The quality, the designs, the dyes, they were unmatched.
Where were they going?
Everywhere. Europe was a massive market, obviously, but also within Asia, China, Japan, the Indonesian islands like Java and Malacca, even specific products for specific markets like those French-made handkerchiefs designed for island taste we mentioned earlier. It was a huge, sophisticated industry involving millions of artisans.
A real global manufacturing hub for its time. Now, what about education? You mentioned the sources are a bit thin for the specific pre-conquest period.
Yes, the Spectrum chapter focuses more on the political and economic aspects for this Eve of Conquest period and discusses education in more detail later under British rule. However,
We can infer things.
we can. The fact that regional cultures, arts, and literature were flourishing, as we'll see, implies that traditional learning systems were definitely active. You had the pathshahs and maktabs, or madrasas, for elementary and higher learning, focusing often on religious texts, classical languages like Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, as well as practical skills like accounting.
So learning was happening, just not necessarily in a standardized Western sense.
Exactly. It was often community-based, perhaps vocational for artisans, and focused on transmitting traditional knowledge and skills. It wasn't a system geared towards mass literacy in the modern sense, but it served the needs of the society at the time. There was intellectual life, scholarship, just within a different framework.
Okay. And the societal structure itself. We touched on zamindars and peasants. How did it all hang together?
Well, as we noted, those regional states often relied on collaboration with local elites, zamindars, merchants, local nobles, chieftains. This points to a stratified society, certainly, with clear hierarchies based on caste, occupation, and wealth.
But functional at a local level?
To a degree, yes. Village communities often had a significant degree of self-governance through councils or panchayats. But again, underlying this was the stark reality of peasant exploitation, indicating significant class divisions. Society was complex, layered, with strong community and kinship ties alongside these deep inequalities.
Right. Despite all the political shifts and the hardships for many, it seems culture was really vibrant. You mentioned architecture, painting, literature.
Absolutely. This wasn't a dark age culturally, far from it. The regional courts, wanting to assert their own prestige, often became great patrons of the arts.
Like the Bada Imambara in Lucknow.
A stunning example, built by Asaf-ud-Dawla in 1784. Massive, unique architecture. Also served a purpose famine relief work during its construction.
And Sawai Jai Singh in Jaipur.
A remarkable figure. Founded the beautifully planned pink city of Jaipur, but also a scholar and astronomer. He built those 5 incredible astronomical observatories, the Jantar Mantars.
In Delhi, Jaipur, where else?
Mathura, Banaras, Varanasi, and Ujjain. These weren't just decorative. They were functional scientific instruments, reflecting a sophisticated indigenous tradition in mathematics and astronomy.
Amazing. What about painting?
Painting flourished too, particularly the Kangra and Rajput schools in the north. Known for their delicate style, vibrant colors, often depicting scenes from Hindu epics, court life, or romantic themes, miniature painting reached great heights.
And literature. Urdu was developing then.
Yes, Urdu language and poetry saw significant growth, especially in northern India. blending Persian influences with local vernaculars. It became a major literary language. You have legendary poets emerging like Mir, Sauda, Nazir, and later the great Mirza Ghalib, whose work spanned into the British period.
And regional languages.
They thrived, too.
Tamil literature, for instance, saw the influence of sitar poetry, often mystical or carrying social commentary. So across the board, architecture, science, painting, language, literature, it was a period of considerable cultural dynamism, even amidst the political decay. It paints a picture of a society that was internally complex, culturally rich, economically active in trade, but politically fractured and facing deep social inequalities. Not stagnant at all.
Not stagnant, no. Full of contradictions, perhaps. Vibrant in many ways, but also vulnerable.
And into this complex, vibrant but vulnerable India, the European presence was growing. This is really where we see the eve of conquest taking shape.
Indeed. The European factor becomes increasingly crucial. They started as traders, but their ambitions grew and their impact became transformative, ultimately leading to conquest.
Let's quickly trace their arrival. The Portuguese were first, right? Vasco da Gama, 1498.
Yes, the Portuguese opened the direct sea route, and significantly, they brought a new approach, armed trade. Their ships had cannons, and they weren't shy about using force to try and monopolize trade routes, imposing their Cartaz system.
A more aggressive model.
Definitely. They established bases, notably Goa, which became their headquarters in 1529. They had conflicts, like with Gujarat, tried to get influence in Bengal at Hooghly, but ultimately their power in India declined, partly due to corruption and administrative issues, but mainly because they were outcompeted by the Dutch and English. Plus, their focus shifted more towards Brazil. They showed the way, but couldn't dominate India.
Okay, then the Dutch, known for being efficient traders.
Very much so. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, formed in 1602, was a powerhouse. It had quasi-governmental powers, could wage war, make treaties, build forts. They set up factories all over India, Masulipatinam, Pulicat, Surat, Chinsura near Kolkata, Nagapatnam.
A strong network. Why did they fade in India?
Again, intense rivalry with the English, who ultimately proved stronger in the Indian context. But also, the Dutch made a strategic choice. They decided to focus their main efforts on the East Indies, the Spice Islands, modern Indonesia.
More profitable for them?
They believe so. The spice trade there was incredibly lucrative. So while they maintained some presence in India, their main focus shifted, leaving the field more open for the English.
Which brings us to the English East India Company. They seemed more persistent, more strategic in India.
They played a longer game, perhaps. Key steps included getting that Golden Farman in 1632 from Golconda, allowing free trade for a fixed sum. Then founding Fort St. George in Madras in 1639, a fortified base, crucial for projecting power.
Fortification seems key.
It was. They wanted secure bases. They also established a strong foothold in Bengal, got permission from Shah Shuja in 1651 to trade there for just Rs 3,000 a year, setting up factories in Hooghly, Kasimpazar, Patna.
An incredibly good deal for them, given Bengal's wealth.
Phenomenal. But they constantly clashed with local officials over customs duties and taxes. This friction fueled their desire for more control, for fortified settlements where they could enforce their own rules, leading to clashes like the sacking of Hooghly in 1686 when they fell out with the Mughals. They were willing to use force early on.
And the French. They came later but seemed to have strong political ambitions from the start.
The French company was reorganized and strengthened in the 1720s. Governors like Lenoir and Dumas were quite ambitious. Their base was Pondicherry. And they had support from nearby French islands like Mauritius and Reunion, which gave them a naval advantage sometimes, especially in the south. Their goal seemed more overtly political, aiming for territorial influence almost from the get-go, compared to the initially more trade-focused English.
So by the mid-18th century, you have the English and French as the main European rivals left standing, both with significant ambitions in India.
Exactly. And their global rivalry inevitably spilled over into India, leading to the Carnatic Wars.
Right. The Anglo-French struggle for supremacy, this wasn't just about India, was it? It mirrored their wars in Europe.
Absolutely. The First Carnatic War, 1740 to 48, directly corresponded to the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe. The Third Carnatic War, 1758-63, was part of the global 7 Years' War. Their fights in India were local fronts in a much larger imperial contest.
And these wars were fought mainly in the Carnatic region, modern Tamil Nadu.
Primarily, yes. That's where their main southern bases, Madras for the English, Pondicherry for the French, were located, and where they first got deeply involved in succession disputes among local Indian rulers. These wars were decisive in determining which European power would dominate India.
Let's look at the First Carnatic War. What was the key takeaway from that?
It ended with a treaty, Aix-la-Chapelle, which basically restored the status quo. Madras went back to the English. But the real significance came from a specific battle, the Battle of Saint-Thome in 1746.
What happened there?
A small, disciplined French force, maybe around 900 soldiers, including Indian sepoys, completely routed a huge army of the Nawab of Carnatic, something like 10,000 strong.
Wow, why was that such an eye-opener, as the source calls it?
It proved, dramatically, that a small number of European-trained soldiers with modern tactics and weapons could defeat vastly larger, traditionally organized Indian armies. This gave the Europeans immense confidence. It also highlighted how vital naval power was for supplying and reinforcing their coastal bases. It changed the game. Military intervention now seemed very possible, very effective.
A crucial lesson learned. Then came the Second Carnatic War. This is where the French governor Dupleix really shines, or at least tries to.
Joseph-François Dupleix,
Yeah.
a very sharp, ambitious figure. He saw the potential of getting involved in Indian succession disputes. He'd back one claimant to a local throne, provide French troops, and if his candidate won, the French would get huge rewards, territory, trading rights, influence.
Playing kingmaker.
Exactly. He did this successfully in both Hyderabad and the Carnatic initially, and he pioneered what the British later perfected, the subsidiary alliance system.
How did that work?
He'd offer a ruler French military protection, station French troops in their state, ostensibly to help them. But the ruler had to pay for these troops. This made the ruler financially dependent and militarily reliant on the French, a very clever way to gain control without outright conquest.
So Dupleix had the strategy, but the French didn't ultimately win.
No. Despite his brilliance, the French faced setbacks, the wars were costly, and the French government, perhaps not fully grasping the opportunity or wary of the expense, recalled Dupleix in 1754.
A blunder, maybe.
Many historians think so. The British, particularly Robert Clive, learned from Dupleix's methods and applied them more successfully later. Dupleix saw the path but couldn't complete the journey for France.
Which leads us to the Third Carnatic War, the final round.
The knockout blow, really, 1758 to 1763. The decisive battle here was the Battle of Wandiwash in 1760.
Wandiwash. What happened?
The British forces under Sir Eyre Coote delivered a crushing defeat to the French under Count de Lally. This effectively ended French political ambitions in India. They were reduced to just a few scattered trading posts like Pondicherry, with no real power.
So Wandiwash clears the stage of European rivals for the British.
Completely. After Wandiwash, the English East India Company stood alone as the dominant European power. The path was now open for them to challenge the Indian states directly and assert their supremacy over the entire subcontinent. They were positioned to take over.
With the French neutralized, the British focus shifts decisively, especially towards Bengal. Why Bengal again? Just the wealth?
The wealth was enormous, yes. Remember, maybe 60% of British imports from Asia came from Bengal. Textiles, saltpeter for gunpowder, opium. Yeah, it was the economic engine. They had established factories there early on, built Calcutta. Controlling Bengal meant controlling immense resources.
So securing Bengal was paramount. This brings us to Plassey, 1757. Often cited as the start of British rule, but you hinted it wasn't much of a battle.
Well, calling it a battle is generous. It was more of the transaction, a conspiracy brilliantly orchestrated by Robert Clive.
How so?
Clive faced the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who was hostile to the company's growing power and misuse of trade privileges. Clive's army was tiny compared to the Nawab's massive force of around 50,000.
So how did he win?
He bribed key people in the Nawab's camp. Most importantly, Mir Jafar, the Nawab's commander-in-chief. Also, wealthy bankers like the Jagat Seths. He promised Mir Jafar the throne if he betrayed Siraj.
And Mir Jafar agreed.
He did. So during the battle at Plassey, large sections of the Nawab's army, under Mir Jafar and others, stood aside, didn't fight. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was easily defeated, fled, and was later killed. Clive's small force barely suffered any casualties.
So it wasn't a military victory, but a political one achieved through treachery.
Precisely. But its impact was huge. It put a British puppet, Mir Jafar, on the throne of Bengal and gave the company immense political influence and, soon after, vast wealth through gifts and concessions. It marked the beginning of their political control.
If Plassey was the conspiracy that opened the door, was Buxar the battle that kicked it wide open? 1764.
Buxar was fundamentally different. This was a real fight, and arguably far more significant militarily and politically than Plassey.
What led to it? Didn't the British replace Mir Jafar?
They did. They found Mir Jafar unsatisfactory. He couldn't meet their endless demands for money, so they replaced him with his son-in-law, Mir Qasim. They thought he'd be a better puppet.
But he wasn't.
No, Mir Qasim turned out to be quite capable and assertive. He tried to reform the administration, build up his army, and importantly, stop the rampant misuse of the company's trade privilege, the Dastak.
The duty-free permits.
Yes. Company officials were using them for their own private trade, even selling them to Indian merchants, which meant huge losses for the Nawab's treasury and unfair competition for local traders. Mir Qasim tried to level the playing field by abolishing all internal duties for everyone.
Which the company wouldn't tolerate.
Not at all. It hit their illegal but highly profitable private trade. This, along with other attempts by Mir Qasim to assert his authority, led to conflict. Mir Qasim was defeated and fled Bengal.
So who fought at Buxar?
This is what makes Buxar so significant. Mir Qasim allied himself with two other major powers, Shuja-ud-Dawla, the powerful Nawab of Awadh, and the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II.
So Bengal, Awadh, and the emperor versus the company.
Yes. A combined Indian army against the East India Company's forces, led by Hector Munro, and at Buxar, the company won a decisive military victory against this formidable alliance.
What was the significance of that victory?
Massive. Unlike Plassey, this was a straight-up military contest won against major Indian powers, including the symbolic head of India, the emperor. It demonstrated British military superiority beyond doubt. It made them the real power brokers, not just in Bengal, but across North India. They were no longer just traders or kingmakers in one province. They were contenders for supremacy over the whole country.
And the immediate results, what did the company gain right after Buxar?
They reinstated Mir Jafar briefly. Then, after his death, put his young son on the throne, but with real power, held by a deputy Nawab nominated by the English. They gained the districts of Midnapore, Burdwan, and Chittagong outright, and crucially, through the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765 with the defeated Emperor Shah Alam II.
This is where the Diwani comes in again.
Exactly. The emperor formally granted the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the right to collect the revenues of these vast, rich territories.
Which leads us to Clive's dual government. Sounds like a clever setup.
It was ingenious, in a ruthless sort of way. Introduced by Clive upon his return in 1765, it meant rule of the two, the company and the Nawab.
How did it work in practice?
The company got the Diwani, the real power, the revenue collection, control over civil justice. The Nawab kept the Nizamat, theoretically, responsibility for law and order, defense, criminal justice.
But did he really have the power for the Nizamat?
Not really. The company controlled the purse strings and also controlled the appointment of the deputy Nawab, who actually administered the Nizamat functions on the Nawab's behalf. So the company had the power, Diwani, and the control over the administration, Nizamat via the deputy, while the Nawab had the responsibility, but no real authority or resources.
Power without responsibility for the company, responsibility without power for the Nawab.
Precisely. It allowed the company to rake in the revenues of Bengal without having to deal with the messy business of direct administration or being accountable for the welfare of the people. It led to utter chaos, terrible exploitation, and contributed significantly to the devastating Bengal famine a few years later. It was the mechanism by which Bengal's wealth was drained, marking a clear transition from trading to ruling, albeit behind a facade.
What an incredible, complex, and often brutal story. We've gone from the internal crumbling of the Mughal Empire
through the rise of vibrant but divided regional powers.
Looked at the society and economy, the culture thriving amidst chaos.
And traced the relentless steps of European powers, especially the English, culminating in Plassey, Buxar, and that exploitative dual government in Bengal.
It really sets the stage for everything that follows in modern Indian history. We've seen the internal weaknesses, weak rulers, Jagirdari crisis, alienation. We've seen the external shocks, Nadir Shah, Abdali.
And how the regional states, despite their strengths, couldn't offer unified resistance due to their regional focus and infighting.
While the British, learning from rivals like Dupleix, honed their strategies military, political, economic, leading to those decisive victories at Wandiwash against the French and Buxar against the major Indian powers.
The dual government was the final piece in that phase, cementing their control over Bengal's resources and marking their undeniable ascendancy.
It really was a period not just of decline, but profound transition. So here's a final thought to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive. Given the fragmentation, the internal weaknesses, the nature of the regional states, was British conquest somehow inevitable? Or were there moments, chances, different paths that could have been taken by Indian powers? How much did the specific limitations and choices of the regional rulers themselves contribute to the final outcome?
A fascinating question to ponder. How much was structural? How much was contingency and human agency?
Something to think about. Our exploration of navigating modern India will definitely continue, digging deeper into the consequences of this period and the unfolding story of British rule.
There's much more to uncover.
Absolutely. So make sure you stay tuned for more deep dives into the chapters that shaped modern India. Thanks for joining us.